Okay, so I've decided that I'm going to make this into a two-piece, two-part thing because we've got into enough interesting areas here that I think it's worth elaborating, elucidating, adding more information on a couple of these items. This started with the fact that I was using the prior episode, this is part 2 of 2 parts, like minutes apart. I wanted to go illustrate how these locking die rings with a hole in the side cannot go on square. Now, does that mean they don't work? No, that doesn't mean that they don't work, because a normal sizing die in a normal press, in a normal situation, even on a bench rest gun, can give perfectly normal results. And especially when normal people throw their cases away after 4 or 5 reloads or 8 or 10 or whatever. Most people resize in increments that I consider to be gross increments. Like they tell you to set your sizing die to resize a thou or 2. And their cases grow and they, you know, there's a lot of garbage out. I'm different. I want to see a case like this, a big old 50 BMJ case, last for 50 rounds. Because number one, I don't believe a case really eggs well until it's been fired 2, 3, 4 times. And that's only when it's been fired correctly in a crush fit chamber. And number two, once a case is built and made and I've gone through all the histrionics required to make a good case, I want it to last for a while. And I don't personally want to anneal. So, with all those things in mind, I find it really fun to use these big cases to illustrate a bunch of things. I'm going to get rid of some of this. These are like my notes from... This is me. This is just a show, and there's no way to prove it. So people, go out and prove this stuff on your own. Go do it yourself. I had a threaded piece, which happened to be a die, in the lathe, and I screwed these various things on there, these locking die rings, and I checked them for run out, which I knew was there. All I did was validate what I already knew. But in case it's hard for you to picture how tightening down a lock in the side, a set screw, a grub screw as it's called in some places, I kind of like grub screw. Tightening down a grub screw, and here's the thing I just noticed as I'm holding this. Can you see that? These have visual play in them. Okay, I don't know if I can hold one side. Hopefully you can see the play. Well, when you tighten it down, it's going to play over to one side or the other. And upon examination, you can see that as you tighten it down, it's going to go this way. So it's going to be cocked. You can, when I said 7,000, there's 14 thousandths of play right there, which translates to 7 because it goes halfway. Anyway, none of the math matters. Math is for people who think that SD is meaningful. It's not. Doesn't matter what it is, the fact is that there is an effect. So, I did this whole episode about die rings, and a bunch of other stuff got thrown in there, and I just thought, you know what? I'm going to, well, I'm just going to throw most of this stuff away. I'm going to keep going on this a little bit because I opened a few more doors. I got so hung up talking about Tiny Tim and free recoil and riding the lightning and bringing the gun up the center line that I kind of ran out of time and didn't get into a couple of things that and then I decided to add something. I'm going to show you how I made a comment. I'm going to go back up here, is how I showed you that this thing right here has a sized case in it right now. The handle is down and inside of that is a sized case. And I mentioned how I let the handle down and it bottoms out just prior to cam over. And then these big cases flex this big dog of a press by 14 thousandths. And how I checked out the feeler gauge. Well, that might not be clear as to what that all actually means. Let me show you what that means. Right now there's a case in there and I take this feeler gauge and I run it up into the area between the sizing die and the shell holder, and I can get a 15. This one is 13 is loose, 14 is tight. But the point is it went from a 0 gap to 14 thousandths of gap in one of the strongest presses made. So all this little initial cam over, I'm going to pull this back out now. This is the case that I just sized. I'll bring it over here and we'll take a look at it. And I'm going to show you a couple of other things. In the meantime, I take this right here. It's bottomed out right now, and then it's got cam over in it already. And yet when I size that big honker monster of a case, there's a 14 thousandths gap in there on the feeler gauge. The reason I share this with you people is because these are all applicable questions. They're all things that want to be answered. They're all entirely relevant and very important. And I want you to know, I want you guys to be able to go out, ask questions, and then answer them yourself. There's nothing like answering a question yourself and knowing that you're structuring it properly. That particular case just came out. It's a little bit tacky right here. I'm using something in this case called Hornady has bought out and is selling Unique Case Lube. It's a lanolin-based, probably product, but the way that I use it is important because these big cases allow me to show things. I've been telling people for years that I reload 6 PPC, 6 BR, 6x47, all the way up to 300 Win Mag, 338 Lapua, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 80, 100 times without trimming the cases. And of course people have been calling me a liar and saying, well, I'm going to start showing you the techniques so that you don't have to worry about Al's opinion versus anybody else's opinion. You can go out and do this stuff. Don't take my word for it. Don't call me a liar or assume that I'm telling the truth. Go out and do this stuff. Here is the cases that I've been going through and showing you. These are the same cases that I just had here 10 minutes ago, and I took them over because I wanted to set one of them up in the die and size it and show you what I meant by the 14 thousandths of clearance. Basically, even though the die is touching the shell holder with nothing in it, these cases take such a sizing effort that it spreads that big O-frame press 14, probably 15 thousandths, because I put at least a thousandth of cam over in it. So 15 or 16 thousandths. But even though I keep saying steel is loose and juicy like a rubber band, it's not quite as. So steel tends to, when you're deforming that O-ring, the force required to deform it increases exponentially as you get further and further from center, which is just big words for saying it gets tighter and tighter. And even though the sizing effect between 2 thousandths of deflection or stretch and 3 thousandths of deflection or stretch may be in an area where it could vary, by the time you get up to 12 or 14 thousandths of stretch on a unit that size, it's getting to a point where that extra thou is going to take 10,000 pounds. Or I'm just throwing numbers out there which are meaningless, except to say that once you achieve a certain place, it's not moving very much. I have established that these size consistently. And again, this is not just opinion, it's documentation and fact. And this is something I want you guys to start doing. Those of you who are not reloading to a high. This right here is my first page of starting and fire forming and making these cases. I took these measurements when it had been fired 4 or 5 times and showing that 820 width here, which doesn't mean anything, it's 0.820 of width across here, is too tight. 818 still too tight. 0.816 to 0.817 is that you can feel the case, but it's smooth. What I'm doing is setting this up to bench rest standard to where it goes in and out of the big, huge 50 caliber gun smoothly, fires, pops out, and then I go resize it. And all of these are, 4.160 fired tight, primer room 4.158, 4.157. This is the sizing back of the shoulder using my Gizzy. This is a dimension that I show on here. I don't expect you to understand it per se, try to decode my way, but just to say that I'm documenting shoulder setback, I'm documenting this, I'm building dies around it, I'm doing this from the ground up. And I've established a load that's working. I'm shooting good out there, and it happens to be 237 grains. It's giving me 2,500 feet per second, and I'm testing neck tension. This right here just happens to say no neck tension. I'm letting you inside my head a little bit, maybe more than most of you want to be, to see how I do stuff. Just to show you some of the notes that I take as I'm setting up. These are pictures of seating depth. This is a wicked high jam on this particular Lapua bullet, which is a really hard bullet. And then I backed it off, and I've got my seating depth set now using something like this. And it's not that I really need a locking die ring on this seater. It's just that I'm changing. I'm going through all these different bullets, 10 different kinds of 50 BMG bullets. I started this whole thing and I went through a couple of hundred of these so-called match bullets from the AMAXs. They've been calling them Max, and nobody builds very much of anything that shoots well enough to tell you that these aren't Max. And then I went down the range one day and I found out that this piece right here extends clear back into here, and it's a big old knobby wobbly thing, and there's no way on the God's earth that there's any manufacturing process that can ensure that this enormous, I don't know, 15, 20, I should go weigh one of these, I will, I'm just guessing, 20 grains, 25 grains here, can't be in here concentric. It must show some eccentricity. It must be somewhat misaligned. It must, so this to me is really not a match bullet unless I can pull these out, which I can't because they got big machine knobs on them. So this went from my match bullet that I was doing all my testing with to subjugated to the crap pile, and now I'm playing with lathe turned solids. I have 7 different lathe turned solids, from Tenix to Lapua to TAC LRs to... Okay, so this is all to illustrate, this is why I decided to do this, because the adjustment assembly on here is a rubber O-ring and it's fairly tight, but with the neck tensions that I'm playing with, this thing has to displace a little bit under neck seating pressure, and there's a chance it could walk. And by walk, I mean come up, and when it comes down, it can go a little bit by little bit by little bit by little bit, and there's a chance. So I decided to put locking rings on here. And then while I did that, I know these are crooked, so I decided, well, I threw these on first, and I figured, a little misalignment, no big deal. 7 thousandths of cant. And then I went, okay, look at the displacement from here to there. 7 thousandths of cant could result in 2 or 3 thousandths of misalignment out here at the ogive on a reload that is way out there to begin with. So you take your 4 or 5, it's entirely possible that I could be setting myself up to have 4 or 5 thousandths of misalignment in the bullet, which is going to straighten out when it goes in and it's jammed. But I'm eliminating variables, and I'm trying to do something that's never been done. I'm trying to get this relatively light, 20-some pound, 22, 23 pound, 50 BMG to fire full house, full pressure, full bone loads into a quarter minute without ripping my freaking head off. So what started this whole rant was somebody on the inner tube was selling 3D printed die rings. And the argument came up as to what's better, and of course there's proponents of both sides. There's guys coming and say, well, this is what I do, and I'm a world record winning shooter, and this works for me. You take a stinking die ring and you put a little piece of lead shot in there and you jam that mother down, and it's so well, it's not straight. It is. Yes, it works for you and it's fine, and you go out and shoot and you compete and it shoots competitively, but that doesn't mean that it's straight. It means that it shoots competitively. There are a lot of things that go into shooting competitively that have nothing to do with straight. It's like if a race car driver tries to explain why his race car... No, go talk to his mechanic. Don't talk to the driver. The driver knows how to do one thing. He knows how to drive the car well. But he didn't build his own car. He doesn't have the brains. He doesn't have the universe. There's nobody that builds their own car and races it up in the highest echelons. At one point you have to realize that we need to specialize here, because my ability to read the stoic is somewhat limited and I need somebody full on. This is the same kind of thing. There's drivers and there's builders and there's shooters and there's self-made and there's everything in between, but when somebody tries to explain something that's above their pay grade, it becomes immediately apparent to those who have actually tested it. So, the fact that these go on crooked is simply a fact. Go check it. Go measure it. So I'm looking at this and I'm going, it's not going to center perfectly, but with a die ring and these tapered threads, it's going to center up within a thou or so, and that might give me, when I've got these tremendous offsets on my bullets, that might give me a little better alignment. So let's just eliminate that. So I'm out building these. And in the meantime, what I needed to build this video for, I got so wrapped up and sidetracked by Tiny Tim and free recoil and all the other things that go into making this thing work, that I didn't really explain the way I validate. In the end, it's kind of like when you're doing math. We learned in second grade that when you do an addition problem, you turn around and validate it by doing it backwards as a subtraction problem and coming back to your initial number. You know, if 1 plus 2 equals 3, then 3 minus 2 must equal 1. That's a self-validating thing. I did a rant a while back about tools and gravity and straight and square, and I show how no matter how cheap your level is, if you run your level up against a surface and it reads a certain thing, then you spin that same level around and run it backwards, and if it still reads the same thing, that validates the level. It self-validates the fact that within the confines of that level's abilities, you lay a level on the table, it shows level, you spin it end for end, it still shows level. So within that measuring capacity, it's equal, it's parallel, it's aligned, it's good. So in the end, there is a way to validate all this stuff. Yes, you can validate certain things by shooting. And you can say the target tells all the details. No, the target doesn't tell the details, it's just results. Yes, your system is working well and you're shooting what I sometimes call bug holes. But if you want to do that and keep your brass going for a long time, which a few of us do, the argument can be made that these cases cost $10 a piece to start with. If you're throwing them away after 3 or 4 firings, they're costing you $2 a firing just for the case. My argument's entirely different. I want this case to last and last and last and last and last, unchanging, because I want every consecutive shot to follow in the same tracks as its prior. I want it to go in with the same feel, I want it to react with the same feel, I want it to reload with the same feel. I think I probably had the first one Davey Dorman ever made of his piezoelectric sensor, whatever you call it, pressure seating gauges, arbor press with the, and later I went on to make arbor presses and just replaced the handle with a torque wrench, an old springy torque wrench, and found a much easier, cheaper, and more accurate way without all the gauges and gizmos. But I played around with seating tension. When you seat this bullet in, you can check the tension on your handle. This one seats with 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds of pressure. And the next sizing, I found out that all this stuff is immaterial and it's crap. But that's another story. In the same sense that we went through histrionics on this end. For years I had all these special tools made up where I equalized and I modified and I did turning and I set depths and I bought fancy, I'm spending $400 on a primer seating tool so that it goes exactly deep. All for one thing. To bring the ES down, to try to get the shots consistent. There's consistent seating depth, neck tension. Does that affect the extreme spread? Primers on this end, do they affect the... Well, I found a way to eliminate extreme spread and get it down to 10. And all this other stuff went out the window. It became meaningless because I had the extreme spread. So if I have extreme spread and I have accuracy, let's say quarter minute, then that self-validates all the things that I'm explaining as to the why. And what I was starting to show earlier, and I'm going to show now, this case started out at 3.912 case length. Now I turn over in my notes here. It's been fired 9 times. It's going in for its 9th time. It's been fired 8 times. 237 grains, Lapua 800. This is the same load. It's doing certain things, it's exhibiting certain, I'm fighting the bags, but it seems to be wanting to shoot. If somebody's looking and seeing, those are my little 3-shot groups, 2 of them touching, 1 out, 2 of them touching, 1 out. And I'm thinking the gun's trying to shoot, and I'm just having trouble keeping the wobble down, but that's an aside. Here's what's important. We get down to the bottom, I'm making my notes, I just checked them again. 3.915, case OAL, and I write growing, question mark. This is 9 firings with a 50 BMG at 237 grains of powder with an 800 grain projectile. These cases are not being babied. That's a hammer time, okay? They're getting hammered. And in 8 firings, they've grown from 3.912 to possibly 3.915. But to be safe in this world, I have to monitor this kind of stuff, because if they start to grow and I have to trim, first of all, they can grow and they can jam and they can ramp my pressures up. And with this much powder, it's like holding a hand grenade 9 inches from my right eye. I don't want it to blow, and I don't want the cases to come apart. So at this point, we have 8 firings on this case, and it may have grown. May have. I'm going to go ahead and probably, brush this off the next time I'll fire. But the point is, it hasn't. Most cases in most reloading rooms grow by several thousandths per firing. 2, 3, 4 thousandths is considered perfectly normal. This has possibly gone from 3.912 to 3.915. In 8 firings, it might have grown 3 thousandths. I'm throwing out the question. And on a case this size, as I said, everything is magnified. So as I'm making my notes, I'm noting groups, I'm noting this and that, and one of the things I'm doing is I'm checking the case length. And so far, it's possible that this case has gone 3 thousandths, which means I have to readjust my sizing die and back it down. Instead of 14 thousandths of feeler gauge, I might have to drop down to 13 thousandths of feeler gauge. It'll still go in nicely, but hopefully I've set all of these angles, and I set my seating die parallel to this and my sizing die not parallel to this. I've built the dies for it. It seems to be working. With my Gizzy, I'm at setback that is so low I can't even measure it. I can't. There's enough variation, I almost have to wipe this out and clean it out to even get a measurement. It's down to near 0. So my final validation is, while loading smoothly on this big case, is the case growing or not? And in that case, I just wanted to point out this one might have grown 3 thou in 8 firings. That's the next thing I'm going to check. And that's why I wanted to make this into a 2-piece video series instead of 1.